Buddy, and if you're just tuning in, you're listening live to my show, The Angel Rock. I'm your host, Lorilei Potvin. I want to welcome most people that have been here before. If you're new, my show, I cover all aspects of the paranormal. Now, that just means anything that's usually not within the mainstream, but sometimes it is too. I always try to have a little bit of a positive perspective and have a lot of great guests. Another one this evening. A little bit about myself. I am in Canada. I'm actually about 35 minutes away from the Minnesota border. I am a psychic medium. I'm also a crystal Reiki energy healer, an Akashic Records practitioner, spiritual teacher and mentor, and I'm also a registered nurse. Now, tonight we have a very interesting guest, but before I start, I should remind you, I always forget to do this. If you are listening, come on over to United Public Radio Network's YouTube channel. You can watch the show. You can see us on camera. We have a live chat room there that I keep an eye on, and I try and involve you in part of the show. If you've got comments or questions, we like to have you ask those kind of things. Also, you're listening to 107.7 in New Orleans, Louisiana. And lastly, when you come to YouTube, you're going to see that you can join our channel. And if you do, it helps support our network. And depending on what tier you pick, you always get extras, but the higher up you go, the more extras you get. There's between 40 and 50 hosts on this network. Most of us are providing extra content, might be extra interviews you may not see. It could be classes some of us are sharing and things like that. So please be sure to check that out. Now, on to my guest. This is another one of my fantastic guests that my good friend Gavin Lee Davies from Wales over in the UK has sent me fantastic people. Her name is Sylvia True. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her as I get my phone in front of me here. Sylvia was born in England to parents who were refugees from Germany. She moved to the US when she was 5, growing up with parents from different cultures, a mother who was a Swiss champion figure skater, and a father who was a theoretical nuclear physicist, gave her varied and unique perspectives. During her summer breaks, Sylvia likes to travel to the Amazon and do research in the rainforest. She has raised 2 daughters who are pursuing their passions. Presently, she lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 2 very spoiled dogs. I love animals. Where she is a high school chemistry teacher. So you're also an author. We're going to talk about your book tonight. Welcome, Sylvia. How are you this evening?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you were patient. I said with live radio, sometimes this happens. We get a few minutes behind. And Joe was right. You got to meet him. I should give him a shout out too. Joe Montaldo, who is the owner of UPRN. He also has many fantastic shows of his own, including his show tomorrow night, UFO Undercover. And he's got one with Michelle DeRoche on Saturdays. He's all over the place. But the thing is, he also produces every one of our shows. I don't know how he does it because he runs a business during the day, but he makes my job easy. I just get to talk. So thank you, Joe. But sometimes that happens with live radio. We had our host chat. That's what he was talking about. So I've been on the air. What time is it here? Our time, after 9, almost 9:30. So I've been on since 6 o'clock. Yes, 6 o'clock. It's going to be a long evening tonight, so forgive me. I'm just going over to YouTube here because, like I said, we'll keep an eye on the chat room there. So now I got to ask you, you've got an interesting background coming from Germany and then your parents. So what was that like growing up? Because those are really unique perspectives, almost something artistic and athletic with your mom and then your dad having a real science background.
Yeah, it was interesting. Both my parents actually fled from Germany because of the Nazis. They were Jewish. And my mother's family went to Switzerland, and my father's family went to England. And when my mother was young, the doctors told her she had weak ankles. I'm not sure if that was the case or not, but they said because of her weak ankles, she had to be put on skates. And once she put on skates, she fell in love and she became Swiss national champion figure skater. And then they moved to this country. My father was just going to do a 1-year sabbatical in Chicago, and we ended up staying here. But it was the science piece runs deep in my family, which is also sort of interesting because I'm a huge believer in the paranormal, and I've done a lot of my own studying and sort of research in it, and that was very looked down upon by many of the science people in my family.
Mhm.
although more and more science people are picking up on it. And I'm not going to get too off track here, but I'm the head of the science department where I teach.
Okay.
And I've renamed us the Science, Technology, and Paranormal Studies
I
Department.
love it. I love it.
So my students get a kick out of it.
Well,
Anyway,
I get it. Well, it's becoming more mainstream now, and I'm what would I guess you would call a light worker. Even though I'm a nurse, I've hurt my
right,
back, so I'm off on permanent disability. And I always say I never went looking for the paranormal; it found us. But even with our own story aside, we've shared it on Paranormal Survivor. It's quite the story. I'm actually writing a book about it. But as a nurse, I always say I've been blessed hundreds of times to be there at the beginning of life. And then I moved out into the community and I did a lot of palliative care. And a lot of things you see when people cross over from this world into the next, whatever somebody's belief is. I'm writing 3 books. I have a son with severe autism, and they all kind of interconnect. And the second one's going to be about our paranormal experience. It was almost 11 years of just crazy stuff. And then the third one, I'm collecting stories right now, mostly from nurses, but also first responders, but things that we've experienced as nurses that are unexplainable. They can only be attributed to the paranormal. So, what was your interest before we jump into your book? Like, what got you started in the paranormal? Because, like you said, it's been frowned upon with the science. Now it's
right,
getting better.
right. But I will get to that, but I'm so glad you are writing that because had a wonderful actually experience when my mother died.
Oh, I'm
Her
so sorry.
parents that no, I mean her parents came for her, and my psychic who is a huge factor, was a big influence in my life. She told me, and I remember this, she said, your mother's going to have visitors. Her parents are going to be there when she crosses. And the reason she was telling me was, a lot of psychics and mediums, they don't like to tell you when somebody's going to die unless it's
Yeah,
useful and helpful. And I
right.
mean, I knew my mother was very ill, and it was incredibly helpful because the psychic said to me, listen, she's gonna have these moments of just pure panic when she doesn't see them. And you have to tell her that they're going to be that they are there. And it really calmed my mother down. And it was beautiful. And my brother, who of course doesn't believe in any of this, did believe that then. And then he poo-pooed it. And my father died just about a year ago. And when my father was dying, my brother called me. They were in Chicago, and my brother called me and said, he was having visitors. So he knew the time, my brother knew the time was close, and it was very close. And, there are so many stories from nursing homes, where that it's really common, and that we don't accept. Well, I do think we are accepting it more, but why it's so difficult for people to accept when it's so prevalent is really hard for me to understand. I don't get it. So anyway,
No, no, you're right about that. And, part of the thing I want to put into the book, especially at least one of them, probably the one with the nurses at the end of life or when there's an accident or whatever. I've studied near-death experiences for almost 40 years. I believe I had one as a toddler, but also the fact that, like you said, people's relatives, or sometimes it's an angel or whatever it may be, are there. But there's also something, a really interesting phenomena that I've nicknamed the gift. Not everybody gets it, but when somebody is chronically and terminally ill and they enter, physically, never mind, like you said, they start seeing loved ones or whomever it may be, visitors, as you call it. I love that term actually. Is they may be comatose, they're no longer drinking, they're no longer eating. They maybe have about 24, maybe 48 if they're lucky hours. And all of a sudden they wake up. They wake up and they're perfectly lucid. And it may only be a minute or two. Some people get, those are the ones that are more hard with family. If you get like 6 to 8 hours or so, some families think it's a miracle, they've been healed. And I've gone through that with patients. But it's almost like it's that gift to the family and that gift to that person to be able to have those conversations that they weren't able, maybe some unfinished business, or just even just to have a joyful few minutes to be back with the person that they knew and loved their whole life. And it doesn't happen with everybody, but I see it happen with a lot of people. And that's what I call it, a gift, because you get that special time before you actually do have to say goodbye. Mhm.
Right. I've heard of that too. And I, with my father, he definitely had pretty significant dementia, but there were these moments, and I don't know if it was like what you're saying, but there were these moments where he was so clear and lucid, and we
Yeah,
was like, wait,
exactly.
hello.
Mhm.
And
No, exactly.
well,
Sometimes it's not much, like, people don't even realize it till
right,
after they think about it. Sometimes it's only a few minutes, or like you say, someone with significant dementia or Alzheimer's, like, they maybe haven't known who anybody is in the family, and all of a sudden they open their eyes and they'd say, "Sylvia, you're here," or whoever, like, it's the person they were before the illness,
right,
took them to the place where they are in that moment. And it's a gift. I really
right.
think it's such a gift. Mhm.
It is a gift. Do you think that that people with dementia, because I've heard this from a few people, and I just don't know, but I would believe it that that they're sort of go in between,
Yes.
both sides. You do. I mean, I thought so with my dad at times when he wasn't with us, I mean, it was before he died, but, I would wonder where he was. It was like he was
To me,
somewhere
that
else.
I have to agree with you. I'm so glad you asked that question. I don't think anybody's asked me that before. No, it's just my thought. When I was going to university for nursing, I worked 4 years in a nursing home. And, even if you didn't check the weather, you would know when there was a full moon.
Oh,
And it's almost like it's the shell of the person they were. It's almost like losing the person twice, right? With dementia, Alzheimer's, because, and then they, when they do pass away versus the person they were. And it's just like they seem to lose everything. It's one of the most cruelest diseases I think that are out there. But, people ask, like, where is my loved one gone? Because it is, and you can see it in their eyes. It's like
right,
they're
right,
not even there. And then all of a sudden, when they have those moments of clarity, and then it's like that spark comes back in their eye, like they remember who you are. And I truly believe that. And I forget, doing a lot of research on this. And I always say, I don't think we'll ever know all the answers until we transition back
right,
home or
right,
whatever you want to call it. Um, but I believe they're astral traveling. And the way it was explained to me by what a couple of my mentors is, it's almost like getting to do some of the things that they always wanted to do in this lifetime, but they may not have been able to go. So they go with that astral body, or that, our soul, if you will, and they travel all over the place. So they're still here. I mean, I've even heard examples of people that really have already left their body, again, terminally ill, waiting just for the physical body to
right.
transition, and they're no longer with that body. They're already out wherever they want to be, in between worlds. As I understand it, and I believe this, working in mediumship too, a lot of our loved ones hang around for a little bit before they cross over, just to be there, help our family with the transition, the people they love, try to be there to comfort them from the other side or whatever it may be. But most do hang around for a while, or kind of cross back and forth before they finally transition back home. I totally believe that. Mhm.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Mhm. I thought it was a really interesting question you asked, and I'm so glad you asked that.
Well,
Now,
I have,
okay.
I've dived into all aspects. Like, I'm so fascinated, and the more I learn, the more I know that there is out there. When I first started seeing my friend Sophie, who was my psychic for 30 years,
Mhm,
I didn't believe in that. I wasn't really allowed to believe in that.
mhm.
And I went because I was curious. And this friend of mine, it was his mother. And I was like, yeah, I don't believe it. And he told me stories. And so I saw her for a number of years, but I was like, I was sure, well, yeah, psychics exist, but mediums don't exist. And then I realized how crazy that was, because you can't like draw this line, right?
Mhm.
And then I was like, okay, yeah, mediums exist, but people don't have past lives, experience. And then I learned more about that. And then I was like, okay, there's just the unknown is such a beautiful thing, right? You just discover a little bit more and more, and yeah, there's so much that's unexplained and that we don't fully understand. And yeah, I believe when I go to the other side, I'll understand it all, and it will be fascinating.
As I understand it, and again, studying near-death experiences for almost 40 years, yeah, and it got me like right away. I remember I've always said I was 17. Yeah, I was 17 actually. I hadn't quite turned 18. And there's a nursing journal that comes out and it says nursing in whatever year it was nursing 1984. I've told this story countless times, but it was the first magazine I'd gotten, and on the front there were two things that have always stuck with me. One was, why are we always eating our young? And the other one was talking about nurses' experiences with near death experiences. Now, the first part was about nurses that were senior nurses, burnt out, not wanting to take students, and it was written from a student's perspective. And I've always remembered that. I've always loved to teach. I've always loved, never push it on people, but if somebody's interested and I'm able to help, I'm more than happy, and always admit, no, I don't know all the answers, but this is my perspective. Now, with the near death experiences, I was hooked right away when I started reading this and seeing these kind of things. And then, throughout my nursing career, meeting people that had had a cardiac arrest, like one of my patients, and you knew them well enough that, they might have been on the floor for a week or two or in and out with chronic issues. And you knew that they didn't have any medical knowledge yet. They were resuscitated and they were able to tell you who was in the room, what was done, the names of the drugs, what order it was done. There were things that, because you may get the science perspective saying, well, no, we know that people can hear during a coma or something else. No, there was beyond a shadow of a doubt that that person in that room could tell you what color uniform people had on, and what a gift for the person to be able to share that with me. I was like so
Right.
grateful. And you just knew. And I don't understand how people question that we don't go on forever. I mean, it's even been proved back in what was the late 1800s, early 1900s, that scientist, I forget his name, but he did a study. He had a scale underneath the bed. And the person was terminally ill. They knew they were going to pass away and get their weight just before they passed. And as they passed over, there was a few grams always perceptible difference after supposedly, the soul leaves the body. So how else do you explain that? What left? Something had to leave. The weight was
Right.
constant
Right.
until they expired, and then, right?
Right. No, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to think about consciousness and what, what goes on and does the mind continue. I remember, have you seen Jill Bolt? I think her name is called it's Bolte. I don't want to say it incorrectly. I don't know if it's Bolt or Bolte. And she was a neuroscience. She is a neuroscientist from this area, from around Boston, and she had a stroke and she did a TED talk and she talks about she was awake during her stroke and she realized what was happening and sort of this oneness she feels, this love and oneness she feels with the whole universe. It will make you shiver because she, is a scientist, and yet when this happened to her, when one side of her brain shut down and the other side just like expanded into this oneness with the universe. She said it was the most incredible feeling. And it's great to hear from a scientist, I guess. But, and I do a lot of reading about the University of Virginia. I don't know. Have you heard of Jim Tucker? He does all the past life studies with the children. I mean,
Oh no, but you just opened up a whole door. I'm getting goosebumps talking about it because that is just such a huge area of interest of mine. There's no way to explain the countless stories you hear of children or birthmarks that show
right,
up, and then you find out that you're able to corroborate that that's
right.
actually part of maybe what contributed to their demise in the previous life. Like, how do you explain all that?
Yeah, well, he's done really rigorous scientific studies. They can't be reproducible, obviously, but he describes what they call an open or closed case. And if they find enough distinct, correlations, then they can actually close the case and they look for, possibilities. Did the family or the child hear of these people before so they really look through everything. And there really literally are mountains of research on this.
Oh yeah.
he followed this guy, this incredible guy who did most of his studies in India, because in India it's a more acceptable thing. I mean,
It's
people,
acceptable. Yeah, reincarnation, absolutely.
right, and if a child remembers, that the family actually goes and gathers as many details
Yes.
as they can to find the other family, and they celebrate it, And here it's, again, I think people talk about it a little bit more, but I used to teach a class called, aside from chemistry, called Science in the Media, where the whole point of the class was to read science for fun, and, just to learn about it through stories and
I
newspaper
love it.
articles, whatever. And we always ended up in the paranormal, right? And
Mhm.
it was always fascinating to me that initially nobody would, I'd ask, does anybody have any experiences or know of
Yeah.
somebody who did?
Yeah.
And, they'd start hesitant. But slowly, it was clear that everyone had a story. It
It
might not be
opens
their
the
own.
floodgates, right? As soon
Right,
as a few brave souls step up.
right, right. It might not have been their own, but it could have been, a friend's or an aunt's, or, and so
Yeah.
people do have these experiences.
And
And
nobody talks about them.
well, yeah, and they're afraid, and it's interesting because kids, they're teenagers. I mean, I teach high school, so it just took a little, one or two, but it always happened. I mean, it always happened that everybody had some sort of story, even if they didn't quite believe it or whatever. So, I mean, people have these stories and they're a little hesitant, maybe not so much anymore, to share them, and it would be great if we could share them, because you go to different countries and different cultures. In Peru, where I've spent a lot of time, I mean, the spirit is in the water and the wind, and it's just
Oh,
a
yeah.
beautiful, what they believe is so beautiful. And they have these spirit paintings that are so gorgeous and colorful. And last time I was there, it's kind of a funny story, I bought a couple of these paintings for my grandson, my granddaughter, and they're very bright, and they always have dolphins and frogs. And
Oh,
I
nice.
brought them to a store here to get framed, and the woman was like, "These are interesting. What are these?" And I'm like, "Yeah, they're in spirit world." Which I said, like, to me, just seemed normal. Yeah,
Right.
that's spirit
Yep.
world. And
Mhm.
she was like, kind of like not okay with it. And we didn't get in an argument, but I was like, I don't know. I'd rather have these on my grandchildren's walls than, a cross with somebody, no, and this is no diss to any religion, but
Of course.
it's just funny what people don't want to believe, and yet in other cultures, it's obvious. They're
It's as natural as combing your hair, brushing your teeth every
right.
morning or something. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. And then some people are so adamant. Well, that was kind of what happened with our story. It started out with a dream. And this dream happened about 15 years ago. And it literally, I can tell you, it felt like it happened 10 minutes ago. I can tell you every detail. And there was a man sitting in my tree in the front yard. And I was out in this dream and I asked who it was. And it identified itself as something demonic. And then tried to tell me stupid things like you could give me whatever I wanted. Didn't tell me it was demonic first. It started out with I can offer you wealth, I can offer you fame, I can offer everyone. All you have to do is agree to follow me. It's not radio friendly what I said in my dream, but basically like who the f are you? And then it told me it was demonic, told me its name, like I said, told me how to spell it. And again, much more emphatically screaming, I told it to get the f out of here. And then it went like this. Oh, no, 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 no. Every time you see a crow or raven, you'll know who it'll be. And I wasn't aware of my abilities at that time, but I was getting into angel oracle cards and I've always believed in Archangel Michael. So I remember calling on him in that dream. It was this brilliant flash of royal blue, silver, white. And then I woke up and I'm not a crier. I was sobbing. I was covered in sweat. And I was just like, just vibrating, so terrified. And that's when all hell broke loose in my house. My partner, Dell, downstairs, been thrown 15 feet across the room.
Oh my God.
We had four spirits we found out. One was like, would take my form. and do all kinds of things. There was like a shadow guy, hat man. There was this dark, and I've got pictures of all this stuff. And it wasn't just our family. And we've been bitten, we've been scratched, we've been, you name it. So this is what started this whole thing for us. And it was crazy. Actually, Dell has the show just before me. We were talking about some of these things. So when it started happening, I thought, oh my God, I have to take pictures of this. Nobody is going to believe me. So I did. I started to take pictures and it became a full-time job, like 12 to 18 hours a day, researching, like, what is this? Like, why is this happening? Then the craziest thing, about 10 years after that dream, and I was raised Roman Catholic. I no longer, again, no diss to religion to
Right.
me. I just, I'm spiritual, but I do no longer subscribe just to Roman Cathology, if you will. And the more I say I don't want to work with dark things, the more I have people contacting me with dark things. Like I've seen somebody possessed on camera, levitating, you name it. Anyways, somebody had contacted me and asked me about this name they had been given. And I said, well, I'm not an expert in the field of demonology in any way, shape, or form, but I'll have a look for you. And there I just about fainted. On the same page was the name I had been given, the exact spelling, and the animal form. This is like how many years later. So this is kind of what started this whole avenue. So it's kind of funny. I always ask people, like, what was your impetus to get involved in the paranormal or have this interest? Because it usually starts with childhood or, an experience of some kind. And I really have to give you props with the fact that you were teaching the class that you were for people to, teenagers to consider science as fun. Because you know what, that's where you can really get a good basis with the paranormal is the fact that, is there something that resonates with you that even if you have to start there to kind of, pull bits and pieces from science, like, does this make any sense to me? And the fact is, like I always say, the paranormal can be very isolating because it's not something that you talk about in line, say, while you're waiting at the grocery store.
Right.
Well, not
Right.
nowadays. But once one brave soul speaks up, everybody's going to experience.
Well, I think that's true. And I mean, not I mean, I'm just going to sort of slide into not that into
No,
a
go
little bit
ahead. I
about
knew we were heading there, but that's kind of how my show is. I don't sit with a ton of
right.
questions. We just
No,
start talking.
yeah, no, and that's how I am. But in terms of my book, the mental illness piece in my book, that's very important to me to also discuss in with my students and to be open about because, it's the shame of the mental
Absolutely.
illness and it's also there's also shame about believing in, the paranormal. Like some people, like a lot of people in my family, they poo-poo it and they look down on it like
Oh,
it's
my mother laughs at people that do the kind of stuff I do and has always made fun of them my whole life. And here, what am I doing? Same thing,
right.
right? Mhm,
Right. But I
mhm.
mean, it's the same. So not the same, but I think that's true of mental illness too. Like, people
Absolutely.
need to talk about it and, get a little bit more comfortable with it because there's a lot of help out there. And, especially it's very important for me. I tell my students I've written a book and they're like, well, what's it about? And, I talk a little bit about mental illness, not
Well, feel
hopefully to
feel
bore
free to
them.
so you can segue into it, please, if you don't mind, to let our listeners know. If you want to break into what it's all about, I would love for I mean, I know, but so our listeners do. Who better to explain it than you?
So the book is called Where Madness Lies, and it takes place in two time periods, 1934 in Germany and 1984 in the States. And both are based on things that happened in my family and to me. Um, but some of the details were changed, mostly in the Germany part, because I didn't know all of the
Right.
details that I knew in this on this side of the 1984 part. But anyway, 1934, my grandmother, her name's Inga in the book, takes care of her sister in Frankfurt, Germany. And her sister's mentally ill, although exactly what she has isn't 100% clear. She was diagnosed with hysteria, which is a, demeaning kind of like,
Mhm.
let's just call her hysterical and melancholy. And eventually she was also diagnosed with schizophrenia. But at that time in Germany, that was a very overused diagnosis.
Yes.
And
Especially with women, right?
yeah,
Mm.
I mean, I think they used it loosely for a lot of people. and the reason being is I think it also led to, the murder of a number of people. But my grandmother tried everything to help her sister. Her sister was brilliant and beautiful and an artist and a wonderful piano player. And in 1933, the sterilization law came out in Germany, and over 400,000 people were sterilized between 34 and 39 in Germany. Now, that was happening in other countries as well, the sterilization, because there was this belief in eugenics to, the purity, race purity, and eugenics societies were common all over the world. And, America at
They
one
still
point
are.
yeah, well, America at one point was leading Germany in their sterilization cases. But so anyways, my grandmother's trying to help her sister, things weren't looking great in Germany. And eventually they came up with the euthanasia law. And, I mean, people with obviously with schizophrenia and manic depression, but also congenital blindness and deafness and
Oh,
epilepsy and alcoholism, they were all sterilized. And, a lot of them also were in line to be killed in the mental hospitals. There were 6 major mental institutions that constructed gas chambers, the same kind of gas chambers that were then used in concentration camps. It was those doctors actually who went to the concentration camps and constructed the gas chambers there. So the way they treated the mentally ill in Germany was really the Nazis' opening act. It was, they really sort of perfected everything. Perfected, well, that's the wrong word, but they really did everything first in the mental hospitals and then brought all those methods and tools to the concentration
I
camps.
think that's so important to stop you right there, Sylvia, just for a
Okay.
second. You said that's their opening act, and they perfected, like you said, their methods. I wasn't aware of that. So how many people really aren't aware of how this started? And I think it's so important to know history and know what really happened, because how else can we stop it from repeating in the future or learning from our mistakes? Go ahead. I didn't mean to stop you, but
No,
I think
no,
it's so.
no. I think that's a great point because it is interesting. And I don't know if it's different here than in Europe because in this country, when I tell people, most people I tell don't know that piece of history
I do.
and really how the whole idea of eugenics led to the sterilizations and then to these gas chambers in the mental hospitals, and the idea of eugenics was believed by scientists all over the world, and it was understandable what they were thinking about, like, let's get rid of diseases and how to get rid of diseases. And of course, the Nazis took it to an obscene end. But anyway, yeah, it's an interesting piece of history. And I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about my sister. She's an amazing person. She's a psychiatrist here in Massachusetts as well. She's a wonderful child psychiatrist. And I wrote this book and it took her, she sort of fought a little in reading it. She didn't really want to read it. I think it was too close in some of the family stuff. And I understand. I understand. But then when she did, she didn't know about, the
Wow.
the history of the eugenics and psychiatric
Okay.
patients in Germany, and that, more doctors joined the Nazi Party initially than anyone else. I mean, they had a huge percentage of doctors join. And, it's scary. I mean, those doctors didn't think that all these terrible things were going to happen. I'm sure, some of them maybe did, but it is scary to think about. You want to believe, oh, it's the other that is thinking about this and, not people like us. But, what is the other if they're not us? I mean, I know that's a little crazy
No,
philosophical,
I
but
think that's said perfectly, and you're absolutely right, because we see this all the time. And again, not that I'm trying to promote Dell's show or anything, but we were talking about using critical thinking skills and also about common sense and taking a step back, if you will, and not just looking at one source for information. If something resonates with you or something somebody says, I have great respect for people that'll share some knowledge and then say, you don't have to trust what I say. Please, if this is just an impetus for you to do your own research using many different sources, because too many people go with the sheeple mentality, or like you said, most of us didn't, and I didn't either, about this, that it started in mental hospitals in Germany. These are important things. Like, this is what I'm saying, that we're losing a lot of the nuances, a lot of the information, the true information from history, because history's been changed in so many places, or it's just not reiterated, in whether it's in schools or where it is. And I think it's so important, because that's how we can learn not to keep repeating the mistakes of the
Right.
past, as well as how to move forward.
Right.
Mhm.
No, absolutely. And I mean, another piece of the book, aside from the historical piece, is that the grandmother, what happens to her is after she flees from Germany, she flees to Switzerland, but basically she lost everything in Germany, her social status, her money, her husband, who wasn't Jewish, stayed. And anyway, so when she went to Switzerland, she really closed herself off. She compartmentalized, she put that part of herself away. She became very controlling of the things she could control, like making sure the clocks were exactly the same, when on at exactly the same second every day, So, she became rigid in a way, I think. And everything was a secret. Everything was not to be spoken of, you know, it was repressed, it was pushed away. And then I ended up in a mental hospital in 1984. So that's my thread of the story. And what happened to me is, I think I was depressed for most of my life. And I was really struggling in my 20s, and I just couldn't, I felt like I couldn't hold on. It was depression, panic. I couldn't drive. There was just like, I couldn't live. I didn't know how to live. And I thought, well, I don't know how to cure this. I wasn't allowed to talk about it. That was, the other piece of perfection in the family, right? Like, everybody has to be perfect, especially mentally perfect. You can show no weakness, pull up your socks. Like, it was completely unacceptable. So I tried to hang on, and I knew I wasn't hanging on. So I did a, really smart thing. I was like, I know it'll help. I'll go have a baby. So I had a baby, which was the most beautiful thing, obviously, and I'm glad I did, obviously. But that sent me, into a postpartum depression on top of my depression. So
Yeah.
I ended up in a mental hospital here in outside of Boston, actually. And my mother and grandmother were completely freaked out. I mean, they could not speak to me. It was too frightening. I didn't know that there had been mental illness in the family. And, all the doctors, the
Because
first thing
nobody talked about it. Right.
well, the first thing they ask you, when you're coming into a situation like that, is there any mental illness in the family? I was like, absolutely not. I'm the only dark sheep. I'm the only one who's not perfect. Everybody in my family is perfect, but not me. And eventually, through I don't know, through my mother and grandmother wanting to help, I got the story. They told me, they shared the story, and it was amazing, because that made me not feel so alone. And I was finally free, because I didn't feel alone. I wasn't the only one. And, the shame still took a while, shame takes a while to peel off. But so, and a lot of the story is about the grandmother facing her own past and having to let go of the things she held on to that she thought were keeping her together. And both the grandmother and me, the granddaughter, had certain prejudices about the other. Like, I thought she was rigid. I did not understand her fears. And I think this really applies in our society today. Like, we're so ready to point fingers and blame, and it's her fault because she said this to me, it's his fault because he did this, or whatever. And we don't really sit down and listen to each other and fully understand where the other person's coming from. And once we do understand, I think we do so much better. you
Oh
know,
my gosh,
if
yes.
we especially understand each other's fears, like, where are these things? And my grandmother had so many, which I didn't know. And when I did, I mean, it just opened up a pathway to true love, which it does. Because
And healing, it sounds like,
right,
and healing. Mhm.
once you can have empathy and you can understand where, and this is true in this isn't just because of my family, and my family's every family's different, but every family carries certain secrets, certain shame, and, I mean, certain fears. And once we can really understand each other and go past those, I mean, we just are so much more tightly bonded. I know that sounds a little cheesy, but you know
No,
what I mean.
mm-mm.
Anyway.
No, and it's so funny that you said this because it's brought up a bunch of things even for me. I remember when my son was diagnosed, my youngest son, he'll be 23 in March, and with no disrespect, he's very much like that precocious age of a 5 to 7 year old, and always will be. And I remember my mother, of all people, that, I never spanked my children. I don't even get into that debate with people. It's not my children. I just know with mine, that was not something I wanted to do. And she would constantly call my youngest the CEO of the street that we lived on, that he ran the house, and on and on and on. It was all bad behavior. It was this. It was never had a clue. Like, I think my mother maybe had him about 4 times in her care for an hour or so. But the reason why I bring this up is I went to my grandmother's funeral with him. There was a bunch of people there. Somebody I knew quite well, actually. Her husband happened to be our dentist, and long familiar, I think third cousins or something. And she walked up to me and she said, "Lorilei, your mother never told me that you have a son under the autism spectrum." And I started hearing this more and more and more. And then I realized it's so funny you said those words, because that's exactly what I said was, if it wasn't perfect, it wasn't
Right.
presented. So my child was not considered perfect. So we didn't tell people. I was a terrible parent. And I'm not getting into this to get into guilt or blame, or
No,
it's
no,
just the thing. No,
right.
but for people listening, it's not like it's a pity party or anything, but I think you open an important door here, that everybody's here for a reason. And, it opened a lot of discussions up for people, because autism, again, another discussion, but unless it's in people's bubble, you don't see it. But where we're going, even with autism, for example, 35 years ago, it was 1 in 10,000 children, depending on where you live. Right now, it's between 1 in 42 and 1 in 45 children being born. And they project by the year 2030, one in every second child. That's scary. I didn't mean to get off track here, but my point
No.
is that it's so important. Again, you know, what's the shame in this? Who wakes up one morning and says, "My God, I'm going to have a breakdown," or "I'm so a postpartum depression," or, we need to have those discussions, especially postpartum depression. I worked in maternity and the NICU, and nobody anticipates that. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to have an issue with mental illness. It's no different than having something like diabetes or cancer or anything else. Nobody chooses these things, and it should be treated as such. Yet, even working in the community, how many people have I seen homeless with mental illness or whatever, and it's wrong. So that's an important discussion. This book brings up a lot of important discussions, I think.
Right. It is right. And that need to be, obviously, which in my family partly stemmed from the Nazis, but that whole need to be, it's not just the Nazis, but that need to be perfect, right? And not to show any weakness. Or when I was in college, it was funny because, I mean, my mother was a wonderful,
Mhm.
energetic, amazing woman. And I had a chemistry teacher, and he was wonderful. And I always thought I failed every test, and I didn't. I always did exceptionally well in every test. And he thought, well, that's odd. There's something wrong with my self-esteem or whatever. And he suggested I seek counseling. And I thought, oh, well, that maybe I should. I mean, I was probably depressed then too, although not what people think of as moping around. I was never a moper. I'm not a moper now, but I had a lot of anxiety and whatever. So I went home to my mother, and, I remember telling her, and it was so unlike her. I mean, she just slammed the door and she was like, "No child of mine shall ever go to someone like that, to see any kind of like counselor or,
Yeah.
therapist." And it was the shame and the fear. I mean, I would say it was even the fear more than anything. And it was because of what happened to her aunt. And, you know, she carried that
But you
secret.
didn't know. So when you don't know, how isolating could that be? Like you
Right,
said, you probably felt like you're the black sheep. You're the one that, and how many times do we hear that in families? Like people thinking they're the black sheep or whatever it is, because especially back in, decades before, people didn't talk about these things or I think you also hit on a really important point. And how many times, if we've actually had a conversation, doesn't just have to be family, could be a friend, could be anybody, and somebody's done something so hurtful, it seems to you, they've done something so awful, or it's like, what were you thinking? Yet when the person actually shares a perspective that they were coming from, or how they saw it, or how they perceived it, or
right,
why they
right,
acted the way they did,
right.
it's like, oh my God, I never even considered that. And you're right. It wasn't cheesy what you said. It's true. It brings everybody closer. There's healing. There's love. I agree.
Right, right. It's just, and I think so much of it is fear based, or it has been in my
I
family,
agree. Hmm.
and when we sit down and talk about what we're actually afraid of, and we open up those, and that's hard. Like if you sit down and say, well, what am I afraid of right now? It's difficult to talk about, more for me and for a number of people more
I
than
agree.
anything else. But that I think will is what really helps us understand each other, you
Well,
know.
it does. And the thing is, too, that once it's almost like how we open with the paranormal, right? We don't talk
Right.
about this, and you never realize that when somebody maybe acts out in anger, or maybe it's bias or whatever it could be. But when you really break it down, right down to the bottom level, it's always fear. Always, there's been things, and I've really kind of even studied a lot of this with working within the light worker field, and there'll be things that people, well, that's a fear. And I'll say, that's not a fear. And then you think about it and you break it down right down to its roots. That's exactly what it is. Or things that, even if you unpack it all, if you will, and you start breaking it all down, it all starts with fear, all of
Mm.
it, and most of it unfounded. The other thing is, people will think like, I don't want to share this. This is uncomfortable. What are people going to think? And then you realize when you have that discussion, 95% of the other people in the room are feeling exactly the same
Oh
kind
yeah.
of things you are.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I can hear, I'm going to read our comments. We got a few in here. We
Oh,
got Stickman
okay.
here. So welcome back. He's a great supporter of our show. We got the Hitman, Blog Talk, Howie Odell. Were you on his show recently? I think you might have been. No, not his network, maybe the Rift Network.
No.
Because I'm trying to remember, and I could be wrong. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I know there was a few things that came up. You were on a few of my friends' shows. He has a network too, by the way. The Rift
Oh,
Network.
okay.
And then we've got Shady D. She usually supports our show. She goes, "Hey guys, I'm late." So I was typing while you were speaking. I said, "Don't worry, we started late tonight." So welcome. I did want to mention though a little bit back to past lives with children, because Zachman had mentioned I have a birthmark on the back of my head. Turns out in a past life I was shot in the back of the head. Mm, there you go. Um, so Shady D also says, sorry, I am unusually quiet tonight. And then she went, LOL, you're welcome. Okay. Now I wanted to ask you when I was reading Gavin, I just love Gavin.
Oh
He always
yeah.
makes my
He's
job
amazing.
so easy.
Uh, no, he's got like the best energy of almost anybody I've ever met. I mean, it's just I don't know. He's so positive and comes up with and so creative. I don't know. He's an amazing young man.
He certainly is, and I've known him for quite a few years now. And for those of you who don't remember that are listening, he's been on the show himself, Gavin Lee Davies. He's over in Wales in the UK, and he sends me some of the people that he's a publicist as well as I know he's done some publishing, and he sends me the best guests. Sylvia and I've never talked. Most people that he sent me I've never talked to, and you just know they're going to be great guests. You are to just sit
Oh,
down and
thank
just
you.
chit chat, because he really does, a great job. He sends you, I don't usually refer to the topics because I know the conversation is just going to sort of flow, but there is one question here I have to ask you.
Oh, sure,
He
sure.
put, your grandfather was the doctor of Anne Frank's family. That I got to ask you about.
Okay, so on my father's side, so both my parents fled from Frankfurt, and my father's family, my grandfather was a medical doctor, and he was a doctor of Anne Frank and her family before they fled to Amsterdam. And my grandfather was one of those people who absolutely could not and did not believe couldn't believe that what was going to happen was going to happen. And actually he was pushed onto a train by his cousin because he didn't want to leave Germany. He didn't believe it was going to get that bad. So they did make it out. And he was just one of the kindest people. I remember him so well. His medical degree was stripped from him, believe it or not, and he redid his medical degree in Scotland, and then was a doctor in Manchester in England for many years. So, and yeah, he was a kind soul, you know.
I'm actually, he put some interesting things in here too. He said, obviously, this is something very real to you, and I want to delve into this because I don't think we talk enough about what's happened in the Holocaust, especially for the younger generations. Really, I don't see enough about that, especially over here in North America. And I think it's so important to never forget what has happened over there. And then he put that it's something that had great repercussions in your life, obviously. And it says, now, in Where Madness Lies, the names have been changed, and some of the details are how you imagined them. But the bones of the story are the insides of the story. Are all of that? Is all of that true?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, my grandmother and her sister and that whole story. And then, of course, the piece with me and my grandmother, that whole story. And
yes,
and it's a generational thing. And it's an important, again, it does, I think families carry through generations. They carry things, and sometimes it's fear and sometimes it's shame, and sometimes, it's football or whatever. But, we see things over generations. And I think that's important to look at too. Like what was passed on to you from your family, and, some great things. I mean, I think the most important thing for me, and this was given to me by both my mother and my father in different ways, is curiosity. My father he was beaten badly in Germany before he fled, and he never spoke about Germany. And if you did ask him what his childhood was like, he was like, oh, it was just wonderful and perfect. And so, there was a lot of repression of emotion for him, but he was absolutely the smartest man I knew intellectually, and so intellectually curious, but just, really academic. And I always laugh because my mother was also curious, but she loved gossip, and in some ways that's good, in some ways that's not good. I mean, gossip teaches us a lot, but, it also passes certain, you can pass on certain shameful things. But so I became, I think what they passed on, the great thing they really passed on was this wanting to learn everything, even if it's what you're not supposed to learn about the paranormal. I mean, just this curiosity, and so what you look at your families and what they passed on to you, good and bad.
Okay, so that getting into the paranormal, because obviously Gavin, I said, like, he does my job so well, you guys. He writes everything down. If there's any questions, mind you, never have trouble talking to anybody that he sends me. But this is interesting because he says you have a strong belief in the paranormal, and there's one person in the book who has visions. It's clear to that these are paranormal visions. Is that what you hope the reader will think, or where do you go with that? Obviously, I don't want to give everything away about the book, but
so there's the character in the book, her name's Cece, and she has visions of the sister who died in Germany. And I think it's very clear that they're not psychotic or that they are actual visions. And she's an interesting character because she ended up in the mental hospital because she was psychic, and she knew she was living in a group home, and she knew the home was going to burn down. And so she told and warned everybody. And then when it did burn down, she was blamed for it. And
I was just wondering that. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there are people, and again, obviously every case is individual. I'm not saying like everybody who has hallucinations is really seeing spirit. I know that's not
a question about that.
But there are people, I think, who are institutionalized who maybe
absolutely.
maybe have more of a connection with spirit. And there are books. There's a great book. This is really interesting. It's called Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And it's about a girl who came from another culture here
Excuse me.
and was basically told she was mentally ill and put in a hospital and given, maybe the wrong medication. And in her culture, she would have been revered, So anyway, I forgot what my initial point
No,
was. Oh, the
that's where I
character.
want
I
to go
do.
with this is, and I apologize, I don't mean to speak over. I forgot to tell you, my Skype is always slow. So it'll seem like there's a pause if I happen to speak over you, and I apologize.
No
But
apologies necessary.
so
Remember,
what
I teach 30 kids in a classroom, so I'm really good with lots of stuff going on. But anyway, the character in the book she does have psychic visions. And the reason she's there is for a number of things. I think mostly because she pushes on the boundaries of the grandmother who needs to learn how to, well, in my vision of writing this, who would get a lot of help in learning how to open up, and this pushes on those boundaries. Like, is this sister still around? And I do believe that, not only I believe my grandmother helped me in writing this, but I do believe that the generations before and after us are here with us. But the grandmother, it was especially important for me to get the grandmother to sort of consider this as well. And then before, the grandmother also eventually has a vision of the sister. And that one's a little murkier because she's also has a fever. So, the reader could easily say, well, that's, a fever and a mix up. But the character, if somebody says, well, she's just mentally ill, they can believe that for sure. But when I wrote it, it was pretty clear to me that, she had visions of the sister.
Well, I was going to add to that with the fact that, when, especially in university, you work in different areas of healthcare. And, there were certain people, even in my family, we have schizophrenia on my dad's side. And I've met many people with schizophrenia in particular. That's not the only thing that happens with mental illness. But what I'm saying is there's been a lot of people that I've really had a question about now. Were they actually really mentally ill? Or were they actually seeing things that were really there, hearing things that were really there that, somebody had, and I think that it's an important discussion because we've talked about the paranormal being taboo. We've talked about mental illness being taboo. You can see why in certain situations, why you may not want to talk about these kind of things. I have a moderator. She actually reached out after seeing our TV episode, and she's in Sardinia, Italy. And her parents, she was an only child. She's one of the most gifted psychics and mediums I've ever met. She's about the same age as my oldest son. And her parents have had her in and out of, for mental health issues and counseling and seeing doctors. And there's not a damn thing wrong with her.
Wow.
It's that, like, she could pick up, for example, I'll give you an example. Never been over here to Canada anywhere. And I live in a city called Thunder Bay, and it's not huge. It's right in the middle of Canada. Got about 100 to 110,000 people. Not a big city. My oldest son, we had kittens, and one of the guys he worked with had gotten a kitten, put him on a little collar, and took him out for a walk, and the kitten got scared and took off. They couldn't find the kitten. I had a vision of where the cat was. I didn't want to go on somebody's lawn or whatever, but I didn't tell her all this. And she said, you have a picture of the kitten? And I said, yeah. And so she took the picture. She went on Google Earth, found the streets where this kitten would be and the house that she's seen in her vision. The other thing is, and there's a few people I've met also that are quite gifted psychically. I have one person I know that is actually seeing through a serial killer's eyes, the children that he's stalking and stuff, and doesn't want to say anything. Another one that can see what's going to happen, like natural disasters and stuff, or things that are going on, but you don't want to see it, like exactly what you said with your book. Then you get blamed for it, or
Right.
like, so what do you do? Like, you
Right.
could see.
Yeah, Yeah. And children with imaginary friends, I mean,
Always ask, I say, always ask who
right,
that imaginary friend is and find out a lot about that imaginary friend.
right.
Mhm.
And we're very dismissive of things like that. They're just crazy, or they're just seeing things or hearing things, there's something wrong with them. What if that's not the case? And again, obviously you and I know, I mean, they're different situations for everybody. And, I wouldn't lump anybody into one, like, no, they're all
Exactly.
schizophrenia. It's
Mhm.
schizophrenics. No, of
Yeah.
course not. But, it's fascinating when you start to really
I'm just
talk.
realizing, though, how important your book is because not only are you bringing up a consummate important part of history about what happened with the Holocaust, or like I said, I didn't know that this all started with mental hospitals, but it just hit me was we've been talking about this, how important it is to have that discussion, not obviously to stigmatize somebody that does have mental illness. And I've always understood and believed in that with the fact that nobody chooses that. Like I said, it's no different than any other part of your body that could get ill or needs help. But the fine line too with the paranormal pulling that in. Like I don't know what the answer is, except that if we could just maybe truly sit down and have a conversation and try to really be open and hear each other. I don't know. Like what were your thoughts? Did you get any revelations after writing this or
Well, again, yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. It's sitting down and really listening and understanding and not labeling, right? Like, if we're just going to, I mean, sometimes labels are useful and they help us. You're diabetic. Well, if you have that label, we know how to help you with that. So we
yeah.
we understand that. But also being so careful not to prejudge and just to listen. I mean, I always say to my students, only a closed mind is certain. So,
I love that. I
yeah.
love that. Because
So,
there's a good example. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no. I mean, it's just about being open and listening to somebody else's side and where they're coming from without judging them. I mean, I have wonderful friends here, and it's just interesting, and I don't want to get into politics obviously, but it's just, again, it's just, you see it all over the place, people just blaming and pointing fingers and accusing, and they're on both sides, and maybe my side is, they don't sound any better when they say, well, all those people, I hope all those people die of COVID or whatever. I'm like, what? Why? That's just as angry and as judgmental as
I
what
agree.
you're blaming the other side of doing.
I agree.
Again, not to get into politics, but
Oh,
just
it
to,
doesn't. I talk about those things on this show too because I agree with you. I said I've never seen the world more angry,
right.
divided, friendships fractured, families fractured. And again with my youngest son, I've mentioned on the show many times that I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was from spirit, but he's no problem now. But when he was young, sometimes he'd just be raging for 3 or 4 hours, and there was nothing you could do but just hold him. I used to say, just ride the wave, right?
Right.
There's nothing else you could do. And I remember one day, it was a really tough day, and all of a sudden I got this in my head, and I've hung on to it ever since. And it says, if it doesn't make any difference 10 years from now, let alone 10 minutes from now, let it go. Pick your battles and go from there. And it's true. When you look at back on this time period right now, 10 years forward, how many people are going to remember what they stopped talking about or what they were fighting about or what this was all about? When really does it really matter? Like, I've said this practically every time I've had the show. Let's agree to disagree. We've
Right.
got a bigger picture here. Let's pull together. This is what's so important. Pulling together, keeping the conversation, that love for each other. Heck, we can even go back to the Holocaust if you want and say, like, look at, like, we don't want to be those people. Those people are bad. Those are the ones we got to get rid of. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but that's how things like this can start, can't they?
Right. Yeah. No, it is. And, right. If we start seeing, in black and whites, and not, opening up to all the other nuances and beliefs, and, Yeah, it's crazy. I do think, we could do that again. I say that, and then I'm a little bit like my grandfather because it's hard for me to believe it's it's hard for me to believe that anybody would be that horrible. But people show us every day they are in different ways, and it's still hard to like. It's like, what? Why?
I'm not going to be the purveyor of bad news here, but you take a look at what's going on right now. Would you ever have believed 2 or 3 years prior that we'd ever be where we are now?
No, I don't. I think yeah, it's been an eye-opening journey,
Hmm.
and it's really, I mean, I think there are more than two sides, don't get me wrong, but and here
Absolutely.
they're the two sides, they both accuse the other of being brainwashed. And it's like, they sound similar in their anger and sometimes extremism. You
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And I guess that's where I'm going with this. And again, maybe it's a conspiracy theorist, and Joe loves to tease me and call me a crazy conspiracy theorist at times, but I like to call it truth seeking. And the thing is that, again, you know, and maybe I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, I'm okay with this. But what if there was a bigger agenda at hand here, and we're just doing their work? Like we're all, you know what? We're all fighting and fracturing, and nobody's talking to this one and that one and that one. Never mind, we got a social distance, and we got so we are stronger when we are together, when we can
right,
talk,
right,
when we can, and then that helps to have the other thing I think we're losing is the art of conversation, because with technology, how many times have you gone to a restaurant, say, like right now in Canada, we're locked down like it was at the beginning since Christmas, but you can go into a restaurant and you see a table of people and they're all sitting there with their phones.
right.
Nobody's
Well,
talking.
yeah, I
Mhm.
see that. Even so, we
Oh,
are
you see it probably every day. I forgot
right.
about that with high
Well,
school.
it's really like, and I kind of joke with my students about it, but so I'll
Yeah,
walk into my class, and now we're teaching hybrid. So we
yeah,
have only a few kids in a class, and they're 6 feet apart, but they
yeah,
could actually speak to each other.
yeah.
But even now, you would think they'd be starving to, be with some friends. And even now, you walk into the classroom and they're all on their phones. It's like, oh my God, you guys, like, we have to like do so. I do what I can. I mean, I get them up and moving in the lab a little bit because when you start talking, of course they enjoy it, but it is so interesting. Like that art of conversation is really getting lost.
We've got some interesting comments here. I don't know how far we'll go with them. I'm seeing a few things in here, but we'll see. We've got Shady D added. Sorry, she said maybe you talked about this before. She said I got here, but sorry, she feels we are headed down the same, or she goes, but are we headed down the same road as World War II? Are we repeating history again now?
I certainly hope not. It's scary. Like I can't imagine. I do think that in the US we have checks and balances that help us that they didn't have then when Hitler took over. At least, that's the positive, I guess, of a two-party system. But yeah, we have to be aware of what we're doing. And when we start just
I
all
agree.
the blame game.
Hmm. I think we are. I think we're walking a fine line myself. I do. I know the leader that we have in power, a lot of people may not hear about in Canada, but there's some pretty scary, dangerous things that are happening up here in Canada. We've got internment camps, people walking off of a plane. I know that the rule changed. You were supposed to have to only get a specific, I think, the PCR COVID test if you went out of the country 3 days before you returned. Well, now when you come back, that's no longer accepted, and you are taken from the hospital to these internment camps, if you will. Some of them are supposed to be hotels. Your loved ones don't know where you're going. And this is not conspiracy. This is like
Right,
independent
right.
news is reporting on this. You're charged $2,000. You have to stay there. You have to pay for another COVID test. And on top of that, the food, some people have sent out video. It's worse than prison food. And you are paying for this too. And your family doesn't know where you are. There's no contact with your family. You can't open your door. Who would have thought that would have happened? And we've got 11 places like this across Canada. Tried to tell a few people about it before it became public knowledge, and people wouldn't believe it. So this is what I'm saying. Like, you need to. I'm not coming from fear mongering or anything like this. I'm
Right, right,
just saying
right,
that it's important to talk to other people. It's important to hear other people. It's important to know what's going on.
right,
I was just talking to a fellow light worker. We've been working on some stuff in Georgia, and typically light workers usually don't, we don't watch the news. We don't get into newspapers or politics or anything because, especially if you're sensitive to energy, a lot of these people, I'm not one of them, but a lot of people, stay away from that kind of stuff. And she actually said to me, I never ever paid attention to any of this stuff, but I do now because you have to. You have
right,
to.
right.
Mhm. So again, it's not from a fear mongering perspective. I think it's just so important to remember what happened in history and to, again, remember, I think, like you said, pulling together, speaking to each other, put your
Right,
differences aside. Is it going to make any difference 10 years from now what you're fighting about, whether it's politics or what it is right now?
right. That's so true. Right.
Mhm.
I try to, you know, if you met, say, every once in a while when you're traveling, not anymore, but say you were traveling and you're in Greece or somewhere and you meet somebody from, I try to explain this to my students. You meet somebody from school who maybe you wouldn't have been in the same clique with and you wouldn't have been friends with. And
Mhm.
but then over there, when you're in Greece, you're like best friends and you
Yeah.
can't believe you're from the same place and you'll now know each other and be bonded for life. And it's sort of like that, like trying to remember that we're just all humans, trudging along with, the same path. And
Just walking each other home.
right,
Just walking each other all home. It's true.
right, right. So true.
Hmm. I'm just read what else she said here. Oh, this is an interesting perspective. She said, I've always wondered if people with schizophrenia were living close to another timeline and were not able to come back to center.
Oh, interesting.
That
I
is
don't know, but
interesting.
that's fascinating.
Oh, we got somebody new here. I think it's Amanda. Is it Amanda B? Yeah, sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. Much love to you all. And then she put 1800s was rife. Not sure what for asylums and therefore after. She said what you and then Amanda says less young, especially. And we can't really, I think, put that on the young because unless they're taught about it, how else are you going to know about it, right?
Right, right, right.
Mm. I'll go through here. We got quite a few comments here, so I'll just go through quickly. Yeah, just getting into a little bit of politics we won't get into this evening. So let me go through here a bit. Oh, sorry. Of course, I hit an email to Gavin. Um, yeah, I wanted to ask you this. I'm glad I saw this. Have you ever had any experiences? I asked you earlier with the paranormal, but what about visions yourself?
So I've had some dreams that have been psychic, but I think my more of my experiences come from the gifts other people, and especially this woman Sophie, who I saw for many many years.
Mhm.
And I remember, I'll just tell one quick story with my eldest daughter
Okay,
Erica,
good.
when she was pregnant with her
Mhm.
first child, and she had just had a miscarriage, and she was very nervous, obviously, with this new pregnancy. And she had an ultrasound. It was on New Year's Eve. I was in Chicago visiting my dad, and she was in Boston. And she called me after the ultrasound and she was so hysterical she could barely speak. I mean, it took her husband and her eventually. She said something like the technician had said there was an artery in the baby's head. I was like, there's no such thing as arteries in the baby's head. Like, I was like, well, what is she talking about? And of course I was worried, and I was like, what? I couldn't figure out what it was. And I tried to calm her down, didn't do a great job, and then got off the phone. And um, I had doctors in the family. And, my nephew's an amazing radiologist, but who do I call? My psychic, right? I go right for the psychic.
I would. I
Yeah.
would.
And I'm like, oh my God, I'm freaking out, Sophie. Can you read, a couple of cards? She had to do it over the phone. And she said, oh, the baby's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with the baby. She said, but Erica can't have sex for 2 weeks. I was like, well, I'm not telling her that. And then Sophie was like, no, you have to tell her no sex for 2 weeks. Something hasn't moved yet. The baby's totally fine. something hasn't moved yet, and she can't have sex. She kept repeating it, and I was like, okay. So I didn't tell Erica that part. I was like, I think the baby's fine. It calmed me down. So then a couple days later, Erica went to her doctor, and the doctor said, yeah, the baby's fine. It was an artifact, not an artery. There was an artifact, from a sonogram. You can get something that looks like something, but is just from, a sound wave. And the doctor said, but your placenta hasn't moved yet. It's
I
still.
knew you were going to say that from having,
Right.
placenta previa, and it's so common, especially with first pregnancies, until it moves up the
And
wall.
it'll move in about 2 weeks. And he said, if you have sex, which is fine, it's totally fine. You'll probably spot a little and you'll freak out because you're who you are. Then come back and I'll give you another ultrasound. But that Sophie had known the specifics, right? She didn't know the words but she knew and this happened to me over and over again, especially with her. And I found that so, I don't know, it was just, it was awesome. Not that what she told me was awesome in that it made me see that these things really are real. There are so many specific things she would say like that. And I was blown away over and over again.
Well, you know what I really believe, and then I've had this argument even with Joe because he doesn't believe me, but I do, is that I believe we all have these abilities. Okay.
Right.
And just as some people come in as natural born artists or athletes or mathematicians or whatever it may be, some people hang on to those gifts and some people don't. There are so many videos speaking about little ones with past lives or whatever. There's this one video in particular I've seen. This little African American little one. She looks like she's about 17 months old, and her mom brings her to visit her grandma at the graveyard. And this little one, like, not old enough for really pretend play or anything like that. And she's talking to her grandmother. And she's filming her. Hi, Grandma. No, no. And she's answering questions. She goes, okay, I give you a kiss. And she kisses the air. There's no way this kid is not talking to someone. No, you stay down. Speaking of animals, I was going to bring up next. My German Shepherd never fails. And we see this, like, how many times have we seen babies or even videos, and they're seeing something or talking to somebody because they're laughing and they're following it all around the room. Or again, get into the imaginary friend phenomena. Yes, I see you. Hello. Thank you. Could you please go down? I knew you wouldn't mind. You said you have 2 spoiled dogs. Anyways, I believe we all have those abilities. And what happens is that as we get older, and whether we get mired down with adulting or whatever it may be, and I think it's so important to maintain the ability to use your imagination, be very visual, and to still remember how to play, because the work of children is play. They live in the now. And I think that is why all children, and I've yet to meet a child that if they say they're seeing something, because my guys were littler when we were living in our house, and especially my youngest was very limited language wise, and he was telling me the same things as his brother was telling him, but from 2 different bedrooms. I believe it, and I don't think it's that difficult to unlock either. There's a few things that we need to do to kind of bring in those abilities, if you will, or reawaken them. I think that women have a little bit of an edge, whether you call it women's intuition or a maternal intuition. The same thing with animals. I always tell people, trust your animals. If your animals look like they're seeing something, and your dogs, right? So you got 2 dogs.
Right.
So, because I kept picking that up about you, that you were really, really intuitive. That's why I was dying to ask you. Mm-hmm. So, like, do you think maybe you might have channeled some of that information with your book? Because, like you said,
I do. I am certainly open to that possibility. Like, I do feel that I was given, it was a gift from, whether it was my grandmother or her sister, in part. Yeah, I do feel that. Yeah. And again, I know some people think that's silly, but I
Well, I don't
believe.
think it's silly at all. That's why I asked you, because I was picking it up about you from the minute. And again, I always tell people this too. If you ever meet a psychic or medium that tells you they're 100% infallible, anything in life, someone tells you that, run, because nobody's 100% infallible.
Right.
But I was picking that up about you, that you're just being kind of modest. But like you said, you've had some dreams, and you mentioned that your grandmother, you believe, even helped you from the other side,
Right.
and I could totally see that happening.
Right. Yeah, I
Hmm.
do. I believe I know it's opened my sister up, the
Hmm.
psychiatrist, and she's had now it's interesting, her visits in her dreams are very clear.
Hmm.
Like she's had clear visits from my mother and father in her dreams.
Oh
And
yeah.
and I know I've had them as well. Although I always I feel greedy because I'm always like, talking to my mother and my father and Sophie, who passed away too. And I'm like, I've asked for signs. I've gotten some amazing signs, but I always want more. Like I know that, and I'm like, I
I
don't
believe
really.
everything you're telling me, and it's not surprising me in any way, shape, or form. Because you know what? The reason why our loved ones visit us when we're sleeping, especially say when somebody's newly passed away, and of course, it's normal for humans to go through a grieving, not just humans, anything living on this planet
Right,
goes through a grieving process. So it lowers our energy, right? And everything is energy on this planet. And so, usually, when we're dealing with something, I believe, over on the other side, it's more high vibrational energy. So, lots of times, our loved ones are with us all the time. Or, like you said, when we talk to our loved ones and you ask for evidential proof, they give it to you.
right,
Always. It's not, I don't believe there's any coincidences. But when we're sleeping, right, that's when our subconscious is most open. That's when they're able to visit and have those conversations and things that we want to have. So, I totally believe everything you shared tonight. Are you comfortable sharing any of your things that you've asked for, possibly, that
Oh
has?
yeah. One of my favorites was I wasn't I was it wasn't that long ago. I was taking my oldest granddaughter to Disney in
Right,
Florida. I don't know which one's Disney World or Disneyland. I
right.
get them
I would
mixed
get
up.
them
So
mixed up too.
what? So whatever. I just say Disney so that I don't make a mistake. But I was reading this book by this medium. And I was in the last chapter, and she had written about her brother who didn't believe in this stuff, but her brother's dog had died, and her brother wanted like and asked for this ridiculously clear, specific sign
Right.
from, um, and he wanted it to come from this medium. And it ended up like she told a great story, and it ended up like that he got the evidence or what have you, and presented to him by the medium. So I read that and it made me cry and it made me weepy. I'm not a crier, by the way, at all. And I was like, okay. And I remember Una was right next to me. Una's my granddaughter. And I said to the window, it was a
Yeah.
plane, so nobody could hear, but I wanted to say it out loud. I said to my mother, okay, if this is true, I need you to show me the Swiss Alps, right? I don't know. Because she's from Switzerland.
Yeah,
So
that's
anyway,
important and
right.
specific to your mom.
Right. So we get to Disney. We go to, no, I can't remember which park we went to first. The one, I don't know. I can't remember the name. I'm so bad with this. But we went to one of the parks. And later on that day, we were supposed to meet my cousin and his daughter, who's the same age as Una, but they were in a different park. They were in Epcot. And Una and I were both tired and we didn't want to keep walking around and standing in line. So I was like, whatever, I'm going to pay the extra however much, $200 to get into the other park because it's for Una. So we go to Epcot and we're walking around with them and we pass this ride called Soaring. You know, I don't know any of them, right?
Mhm.
But Adeline, the other little girl, is like, that's her favorite ride. She wants to go on it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to stay. I'll wait for you guys out here. I don't have a fast pass. I'll just wait for everybody. But Una, who was very free spirited and would absolutely was like, you have to come. You have to come. I'm like, okay, of course, I'll do anything for you.
For your
So
grandchild,
then
yeah.
we stand in a line. We're standing there for like 40 minutes. I'm like, let's just go out to dinner. This is not worth it. And then there are other people who are returning, but they weren't on the ride because the ride was broken. So I was like, okay, now this is a sure sign. We cannot go on this ride.
Yes.
But when, our group was let in and we were put on this ride and we were buckled in, and Una was so excited. And it makes you feel, I don't know if you know anything about these rides, but it is the most amazing experience. You feel like you're flying, you feel like you're soaring, right?
Oh, I
And
love
I
it.
don't, you're buckled in,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, the lights go off, and there we are flying above the Swiss Alps. And I I know, I mean,
Oh my gosh.
it was one of three signs that my mother sent me very quickly,
Yeah.
within like 3 weeks. And they were all so specific. And I know, is it coincidence? It could be, but I remember the feeling. I was like, oh my God. I wasn't supposed to go to Epcot.
Yeah.
I wasn't supposed to go on this
Yeah.
ride, whatever, but I was. I was
Yeah.
supposed to be all of those things. And the other things I asked for were also very specific. And
Yes.
she always comes through. And I'm like, how can that be?
Because they hear us, they never leave us. I truly believe that. And you can ask that. You can ask that of your guides. You
Right,
can ask, I
right,
call them spirit collectively. Any of our loved ones, I always tell people whenever somebody pops into your head or you just think of them, or maybe you're always thinking of them over on the other side, they're with you. They're
right,
always with you. They hear
right.
you. They hear everything you say to
You
them.
know, I
Mhm.
I do believe that. It's funny because especially Una, my granddaughter, she's 6, and she asked me not long ago. We were having dinner, and I don't know how much. I don't. I of course I believe this, and I think my daughter also believes this.
Yeah.
Because of all the things she's seen and heard from me. But Una asked me. I thought it was such a great question. She said, "So Oma," she calls me Oma.
Yeah.
Um, when you speak to somebody on the other side, do you have to speak out loud, or can you just speak to them in your head?
You
Like,
can speak to them in your head.
right.
Mhm.
But that somehow she knew that,
Mhm.
right? At 6. I thought that was such
I
an,
was gonna ask you, have you ever asked her who she was before? Maybe she might know. Mhm.
no, I haven't. Yeah, I
I got
haven't.
that feeling about your granddaughter. I think she's wise beyond her years, that one. I think she's an old soul.
Yeah, I do
She
too. I think she
probably
did.
asked you because she knew she could ask you.
Right.
Also, because did you ever ask her why she asked you that?
No, I just knew she understood. Like she
But
wanted to
maybe she
know.
wanted you to ask her. Maybe she had a reason why.
Right.
Maybe she, I don't know. You know your granddaughter better than I would ever know. I mean, I don't know your granddaughter, but I don't know. I have a feeling that's why she asked you some of these questions. She probably
Right.
asked you, right? Because
Yeah,
she's
yeah.
pretty advanced for 6, isn't she?
Right. No,
Mhm.
they're interesting. If again, it's just always comes back to the same thing. It's an openness. Like, she didn't, there was no shame in asking that. Do you know what I mean? Like, just like it was just a fact, like she was just looking for information. Like,
But she knew she could ask you and there would be no judgments. Or why would you ask me something like that? Where
right,
somebody might say that to her,
right,
right? Why would you even ask me something like that?
right. No, she obviously believes that you can speak to them. She just wanted to know, can you do it in your head as
She
well?
probably can do it. Probably,
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe she is a medium. Maybe she's already. I
Right.
hate to tell you this, we're already
I
out of
know.
time.
I'm
You
sorry.
know what, Sylvia? I hope you'll come
Uh,
back again. I love talking to you. It's such a great conversation with
I
you.
can't wait to read. Can you, whenever you're written something, I really would love to read it.
Okay, for
So
sure,
you
for
have my
sure.
email, send it. I'll read
Okay.
anything.
That's how I never make reservations or New Year's reservation. Sorry, my brain is not working. Resolutions. I've been on
I,
the air. I told you since 6 o'clock. But that is one of them because I have an outline for all the books. So I
oh,
definitely.
good.
Well, I hope we'll stay in touch because, like I said, I'd love to have you back on. We've just barely scratched the surface on some
I
of
know. It was
this
so
stuff.
great
So,
to talk to you. Thank you so much.
well, thank you. Where can people find you? Where can they buy
Oh,
your
sorry.
amazing
Yeah.
book and all that stuff?
So I have a website, sylviatrue.com, but the book,
Excuse
you can Google it. It's at every bookshop and Amazon and however. And I, love people to read it. I love to be in touch with anybody who's interested.
Oh, you got a lot of people here that are interested in the paranormal. Zach Mann said quickly before we go, he said, "Great show tonight. Thank you, Sylvia, for joining us tonight. Have a good night, everybody, and see you all tomorrow night. Because yes, I will be back tomorrow night. So I do
Well,
want to
good for
remind you
you.
guys. I want to remind you guys all that I will be back with the Angel Rock tomorrow. Sorry, Monday night next week. I believe, yeah, we're having Michael Roser back on. He was on a few weeks ago. We're going to be talking about UFOs and what the CIA has now supposedly declassified with UFOs. I'm also going to be on his show this Monday, or this, my brain is not working, this Friday, actually. And I will be back tomorrow night, Tuesday night, from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Central Standard Time with Tripping the Void with my PIC, I call her partner in crime, Seraphine Hurley. So I hope you will join us. I want to send you guys all so much love and light. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Sylvia.
Oh,
That was such a
thank
pleasure to
you.
have you.
That was so much fun. All right. Nice to meet you. Bye.
Nice to meet you too. We'll talk soon.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye.
Have a good night.